Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. With great pleasure, I welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Ravi Srivastava. I also welcome our Dean, Dr. G.L. Tayal, our senior faculty member, Dr. Khan Masood Ahmed, my colleagues, and all the students from ISBF and other colleges who have joined us today. A very warm welcome to ISBF Distinguished Public Lecture Series. We at ISBF always strive to make sure our students not only learn from the books, but also look at the real world problems and analyze the global situations. Towards this objective, we started ISBF Distinguished Public Lecture Series, where we invite eminent people to share their insights on the current issues and developments with our students. These lectures, which look at various economic, finance, or management scenarios, provide a great platform for everyone to have a Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, Delhi. He was earlier Professor of Economics and Chairperson of Center for Study of Regional Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a full-time member of the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, chaired by late Dr. Arjun Sen Gupta in the rank of Secretary with Government of India from 2006 to 2009. He received his education in University of Allahabad, Delhi School of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and University of Cambridge, UK. His main areas of research and publication include labor and employment, migration, social protection, agriculture, rural development and rural poverty, the informal sector, regional development, decentralization, human development, and land reforms. He has published 6 books, 5 monographs, more than 110 papers in national and international journals, and has produced 35 research reports and has carried out more than 35 major research projects sponsored by agencies such as UNICEF, ILO, the World Bank, ESRC, UNFPA, UGC, Indian Council of Social Science Research, Shastri Indo-Canadian Foundation, and others. He is a recipient of numerous awards and scholarships, including the Commonwealth and the Fulbright Scholarship, the UGC Award in Economics in 2001 for innovative research on poverty, combining qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and more recently, the V.V. Giri Memorial Award in 2009 for contribution to research on labor migration. He is former chairperson of the Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur. He has been member and chairperson of a number of committees of UGC, MHRD, Planning Commission, and ICSSR. He was also a member of ICSSR Governing Council for 2 terms between 2005 and 2011, and member of its research committee till 2017. He is member of Governing Board, Institute of Human Development, Delhi, and has been member of Governing Board, Academic Council, Executive Council, and Board of Studies of a number of universities and institutes. He has performed consultancy and advisory roles for the Planning Commission, Indian ministries, state governments, international agencies such as the World Bank, ILO, ADB, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, and numerous other governmental and non-governmental agencies. He is the past president of the Indian Society of Labour Economics and current president of the UP and Uttarakhand Economics Association. Sir, it's a privilege to have you with us today. I now kindly invite you to start the lecture.
Thank you very much, Resha, and my thanks to Dr. Tayal, Professor Masood, etc., for inviting me to give this lecture. I think all of us, I don't know how much we were exposed to migration theory, and so on earlier. But during the pandemic, the recent pandemic, the corona pandemic, all of us certainly saw a great deal, possibly read in newspapers, but certainly visually saw this great migrant crisis which engulfed India, in which we saw many millions, and I'll come to the estimates later on in my lecture, of migrants leave cities, leave states in which they had been working, and try to get back to their native places. walking. There was a time when almost every highway which led from the north to the east, from the south to the north, from the west to the east, was full of migrants trying to get back to their native places on foot, on bicycles, on push carts, and then a little later using different kinds of vehicles. And this was a completely a bewildering sight to those of us who had not really thought seriously about how migrants were fueling the growth of this country. And we heard about the crisis. We heard how they were, once they got back to the villages, how they were exposed to a different set of conditions, unemployment. We heard about the policies which the governments, the union government and the state governments were making to to help those in the crisis who are facing the brunt of this crisis, and the migrants and so on. So many of us, as I said, who earlier may not have academically been exposed to the word migration, who may not have studied it, would all have been exposed to this crisis in the last few weeks and months. So I'm going to deal with the way I am going to talk about this migration today and this crisis, the responses to this crisis, is to first talk in general, to expose you. I believe many of you would be students of economics. Some of you may not be students of economics. You would be doing the business administration courses or the finance courses. So you may not have a formal analytical understanding of migration and its links with growth and development. Uh, I'll spend the first few minutes in exposing you to the links between migration and development and growth. And then in the next part of my lecture, uh, we'll talk specifically about the migrant crisis. In the final part of the lecture, I'll talk about policies. The kind of policies the government of India has initiated, but also what is needed going forward from here. So let me first begin with this whole question and notion of migration very broadly, and I'll come back to the specifics. Very broadly, migration involves the mobility of people from one place to another. There are formal and technical ways of deciding when one is a migrant and one not a migrant, because every mobility is not treated as migration. When you and I go for a holiday, this is not treated as migration. When we visit relatives in other cities, this is not treated as migration. So what is migration then is something which we fix a definition, an analytical definitional label, and then we try to measure what migration is. And I'll come back to that later. But what we do know is migration is as old as human history. It's impossible to talk of migration without linking it with the first days of human history. Just imagine, uh, everybody knows the Andaman Islands, and the Great Andamanese. And the Great Andamanese share racial features with the Negroid race, which basically inhabits Africa. At some point of time, even when the continents may have been joined, the distance between what is Andaman now and the African continent would still have been a few thousand kilometers. But this racial connection shows us that at some point of time in the past, people did walk thousands of kilometers to get from one part of the continental shelf to a completely distant part of the continental shelf. In fact, as we try to disentangle our own genetic endowment, we find that people were traveling uh, tens of thousands of kilometers and miles uh, millennia ago. What motivated these travels then? Because they were living in a completely different socioeconomic historical context, is something we will never know. We do know that as societies settle down, they settle down beyond the agro-pastoral times, and we had settled societies, we which began to evolve their own governance structures. The states began to take an incipient form. From that time onwards, we know that there were different forms that migration took. People migrated because they were the early refugees. Wars started happening, so people fled. There were disasters, ecological disasters, natural disasters. People migrated because of army movements, and armies, even in those early days, sometimes moved thousands of kilometers in quest of more territory, more land. People moved as traders, and early traders themselves actually traveled thousands of kilometers. So we know that early movements started taking place for a whole range of reasons, ecological reasons, economic reasons, military reasons, administrative reasons, and so on and so forth. In fact, if you go back, if you think of early societies and prehistoric societies, people who were either living in forested areas or gradually became agro-pastoral, and then you think that in sometime in the past, sometime in the very past, we started having settlements. We started having large settlements, which we now call urbanized, urban settlements in urban areas. And we know that Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were really urban civilizations. At least when we look at the archaeological remains, we are actually living in cities. And there were a whole range of urban civilizations spreading across the globe, from Latin America to the Middle East to India, and dating back to something like 5.5 to 6,000 years ago. The moment you have an urban civilization, that means that that people started congregating together, and people would only have started congregating together if there had been some form of migration. So migration and urbanization, actually you almost speak of migration and urbanization in the same breath. Uh, which is why you find this enormous, so the density of population. Why would people have started congregating in urban areas? And again, one can see various motivations. Uh, there were basically, the reason why people congregate together is because the cost of transacting with each other when you live in a denser habitation is lower. Uh, you can get across, talk to each other, you can communicate to each other, transportation costs are lower, so you can meet more quickly. So there is a whole range of reasons why, because of transactions, or the whole range of economic reasons and non-economic reasons why people would tend to congregate together in something called an urban civilization, an urban city. But whenever cities come together, they also perform another function, which is a purely economic function, which is that they begin to provide markets. They begin to provide markets. They begin to provide large markets. And the moment you talk of large markets, then as Adam Smith pointed out, there is the notion of specialization. There's the notion of division of labor. So market spaces provide in an instant cause for division of labor and specialization. And specialization and division of labor leads to some degree of economic functionality. And so markets, the growth of urbanization goes hand in hand with specialized production and with division of labor. So this is something which we can immediately, understand in the context of urbanization. And here I'm talking about urban societies which go back many, many centuries. With urban societies going back that many centuries, you also have industrial functions, the growth of industrial functions. So you can see that initial manufacturing activities coming together in different forms, maybe forms which may not be as sophisticated manufacturing as what we see now, but nonetheless, manufacturing activities coming together in some form or the other. And over the whole historical span, where the forms of industrial organization, forms of economic organization changed significantly, you find migration and urbanization moving hand in hand. With the growth of industrial capitalism, and industrial capitalism, as you know, began to evolve in the 16th, 17th century, And with the growth of industrial, then with industrial revolution in Britain first, spread to other parts of Europe, and so on, you had a phenomena of large-scale production, factory production happening. And factory production led to another explosion in urbanization, urban densities and urban and this thing, and it also led to industrialization. And the industrialization naturally had to be fed with a larger and larger workforces, and these workforces were mobilized from rural areas. Whether they were mobilized spontaneously or not spontaneously is another something which we can investigate. But what is true is that rural urban migration became associated with the growth of industrialization. So migration, urbanization, and industrialization went hand in hand, and we associate these three together. And we cannot really think of industrialization and the growth of modern history, because modern structural transformation is essentially about turning agricultural and rural populations into urban and industrial populations. So we cannot understand modernization without really understanding the role of migration and rural urban migration. The broad point that I want to make is that very often, if we miss this connection, what we don't understand is that there is an integral link between migration, structural transformation in the form of industrialization and growth. Very often we struggle to find this connection, but this connection is very much a integral part of human history, which is why early development theories, from the time that we started, early development theories, early migration theories, started dwelling on this link. And you find that from Ravenstein in the 19th century to the standard development theorists in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, you find that they started dwelling on this whole question of the link between migration and development. You had the dualist models of development, and the dualist models of development basically then talked about the differentials in productivity between rural areas and urban areas. With the growth of industry in urban areas, industrialization became the driving force of productivity. Productivity became higher in urban areas. As it became higher in urban areas, because productivity per worker became higher, the ability for industry to pay higher real wages to workers also came to exist. And industry required workers. It then pulled out workers from agricultural areas to join industry. And these workers then became the source of capital accumulation, capital formation. So in effect, rural-urban migration became the source of capital accumulation and the growth of industrialization in urban areas. This is what we learn from early development theory. From development theory, the link between migration and industrialization and urbanization. And this is what we recognize if we look at the empirical features of migration. The early theories of migration, going beyond development theory, which intrinsically understood that people would be drawn through migrations process, which would link to rural and urban areas of migration. People would be drawn from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. And these high productivity activities were essentially industrial activities. And this would fuel rural urban migration. This then naturally led from the 60s onward to an understanding of the theories of migration. So we started specifically looking at this migration effort, and naturally the most important theories of migration then focus on productivity differentials. Productivity differentials and income differentials between rural and urban areas. So you had, because you had low incomes, low wages in rural areas, higher incomes and higher wages in rural areas, we had classical theories of migration, which said that people would move from areas where wages were low to areas where expected wages were high. And earlier, this was all about wages. Then people started looking at employment. So there was a shift from looking at wages to looking at expected differentials in expected earnings, which is where people like Todaro and the Harris-Todaro model came in. Then there was an understanding which gradually developed that, look, expected earnings is all right when people move from rural to urban areas. They don't necessarily immediately get absorbed in industry. And gradually in the 80s, we started talking about the role of the informal sector. So the informal sector became a waiting hall. People would move from rural areas. If they did not get a job in industry immediately, they would sit or work in this waiting hall called the informal sector, gradually be absorbed in industry. So this is how the initial theories, the classical theories of migration evolved in order to understand this process of migration. Gradually, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then beyond, we've had a whole set of theories of migration. And I'm not going to go into these broad theories of migration here. That's not the purpose of this lecture. But yes, I would like to say that there are three broad strands of migration, which I think one needs to understand, which can be also collapsed into two broad strands in terms of theories of migration. So the first is what we call the classical theory of migration. And the classical theory of migration, as I said, basically builds on the fact that people would move from areas where there were low expected earnings to areas where there were high expected earnings. So there would be a factor movement. And ultimately, as this movement would happen over a long period of time, it would result in some kind of an equilibrium. So this was the classical theory of migration. But this was counterposed from the very beginning to neo-Marxist theories of migration, which basically thought of migration, neo-structuralist, neo-Marxist theories of migration, which said migration is really a result of disequilibrium, a disequilibrating process. And they feed not only a result of a disequilibrating process, but it's a cumulative process of disequilibrium. Professor Gunnar Myrdal, one of the early, economists who got a Nobel Prize for his enormous work on institutions and development. Also, then, for example, he talked about what he called the backwash effects of development. And the whole idea was that as certain areas develop, resources, including labor resources, flow from less developed areas into highly developed areas. But this causes further disequilibrium. As skilled people, as skills move from low developed areas into high developed areas, the gap between, so there is a backwash effect, and the backwash effects actually causes a larger gap, a larger level of disequilibrium between the poorer areas and the richer areas. So the whole set of the large number of these, what are sometimes called the world system theories, neo-structuralist theories, neo-Marxist theories, which argue that actually what you see in the form of present day migration is caused by structures of capitalist and imperialist development, which lead to unequal development between regions. And it is this unequal development then which pulls workers from one area to another area, and which then leads to further disequilibrium. So in contrast to classical theories of migration, you have these world system theories of migration, which focus on disequilibrium. But within this broad classical theory, the classical theories of migration are individual focused. So they talk about expected earnings and migration as a response to expected earning differentials. From the 90s, we had a new strand of theories, which we refer to as the NELM theories. And these NELM theories, which focus more on risk and uncertainty, labor market theories, actually moved away from looking at individual decision making at the core of migration to looking at migration decisions being affected by household decision making, and risk basically households taking a decision on sending some people out uh, to other areas to earn some living. But this was not only to maximize incomes, but this was also a risk diversification. This was a strategy to diversify the risk which households face. So it moved the decision making for migration, whether to migrate or not, or who would migrate or not, actually moved from the individual sphere to the household sphere. And the new economics of labor migration also then could be extended not only to households, but also to networks. So there were network effects of migration, which facilitated migration. As migration happened, people in destination areas provided networks, and those networks provided the kind of nexus along which migrants traveled in specific migration streams. At the end of the day, the new economics of labor migration was in some sense also part of equilibrium economics, because it still talked about a form of equilibrium being derived by households which were trying to minimize risk. But they were not posited in terms of individual decisions. The interesting thing about the new economics of labor migration was that since it talked about migration being a household decision, therefore, some people from a household could migrate and some people from a household could stay back. So the new economics of labor migration fitted it with empirical facts, which showed that very often when people migrate, they do not, they do not sever connections with their families and households. Some people stay behind, some people migrate. Those people who migrate then send back earnings to the remaining members of the household. So you have both kinds of things. You have some members migrating and some members staying back. New economics of labor migration could therefore explain to us what one phenomena which I will devote some time later in this session, which is circular migration. Why is it that people come back to households? It can also explain to us why is it that people maintain connection with their families or part of their families which remain in rural areas. Why do they send back money? Why do they send back remittances? Now, so far, I've only talked about basically what drives migration. Why does migration happen? And I've also said that in a broad sense, migration and development go hand in hand. So migration, urbanization. But but when we say that migrate in a broad historical sense, migration, urbanization, and industrialization go together hand in hand. Actually, the relationship between migration and development is really not so smooth. It is not, and we have to understand how exactly can this relationship, how does this relationship exist, if it all exists. I've already pointed out to you that the world system theorists saw migration as a part of a global strategy of industrial capitalism to source workers from certain areas to the capitalist core. So here, when you look at migration within the context of the kind of disequilibria which industrial capitalism causes, then migration may not necessarily only cause development. It might cause growth in the periphery, but it might cause backwardness it might cause growth in the core areas, but it might cause underdevelopment in the periphery. So already the world system theorists were saying that, look, migration and development need not go hand in hand. Migration may feed into capitalist development in the core areas, but it might actually work to the detriment of the source areas. But going beyond that, if indeed you break up migration, so far we have spoken of migration as, as affecting everybody in the same way, and the migrants somehow being homogeneous. But if you think of migrations, the migrant streams consisting of different types of migrants, some well endowed, very well educated, some less educated, some very well endowed in terms of wealth, some not so well endowed in terms of health, and some very poor. Then also the heterogeneity of migration also means that different sets of people could be affected very differently. It could be that those who have adequate resources, adequate human resources, could take place of certain types of opportunities which exist within the migration stream, whereas other migrants would not be able to take recourse to the same kind of opportunities and would get sucked into migration at their own cost. So for them, their own development, the development of their household, the development of their areas from which they come would not have the same meaning. So basically, the nexus between migration and development is an extremely complex, is a very complex area. It's not something which automatically follows, and the link is not automatically understood. There are multiple types of nexus. For example, there's a very important nexus which exists through remittance flows. When migrants migrate from one area to another area, when they live in those areas, then they remit money, whether it's international migrants or whether it is internal migrants, they send money home. And this money can become a source, can theoretically become a source for improvement in the source areas, improvement of their households' well-being conditions, improvement it can become a source of investment in the countries concerned. It can become a source of investment in the regions concerned. So this can be a positive thing. There can be negative spin-offs. For example, as I've already told you, it could be that highly skilled people migrate out of poorer areas into richer areas. So the richer areas provide a better suction pump for skill development, for skilled migrants. And as this happens, there is a brain drain from the poorer areas. So if you look at the literature from the 80s and the 90s and so on, it was dominated by what was called the economics of the brain drain. Skilled people leaving, and even now, even today, there is a lot of concern that migration tends to attract the highly skilled people from developing regions and the poorer regions to highly skilled areas. If you look at the immigration policies of richer countries, they give a price tag, and they tend to be favorably inclined towards their immigration laws treat the skilled migrants more favorably than unskilled migrants. So they are willing to absorb skilled migrants permanently, whereas they are not willing to absorb unskilled migrants permanently. So there is a premium which they place on skilled migrants, and thereby they innovate, they weaken the source of skilled migration, which comes from poorer areas, poorer regions. This can again be, on the one hand, remittances could actually strengthen the source regions, but on the other hand, these factor flows, the more skilled people flowing out of these areas could be have a negative impact. Then, as I have already pointed out, if the poorer migrants are getting sucked into migration streams in ways in which they are not able to prosper, they are not able to be included in the process of development, there would again be negative spin-offs. So there is a very complex relationship between migration and development. And this is not only from the point of view of the source regions and the migrants themselves. If you look at it from the point of view of regions where migrants go, and this holds both for regions within a country, but also if you look at international migration, you will invariably notice that migrants are not welcome. Internationally developed countries are constantly putting barriers to migration of all kinds. Within countries also, technically there should not be barriers to internal migration, But there are a large number of ways in which states, regions tend to put barriers to larger number of migrants coming in. Now, if migration indeed was something which was automatically fueling growth and development in the core capitalist areas, why is it that migrants are not, not welcome? Why is it that they're not welcome? Why do policies tend to restrict migrants? And this is precisely for the reason that regions which are more developed would like to develop as enclaves where they would like to protect their gains in terms of higher wages, higher levels of living, etc. And they believe, rightly or wrongly, is something we can discuss, but they believe that if more migrants come in, then this would have a negative implication for their levels of living. This would have a level for their income, for wages, and for their employment. So for these reasons, they tend to deter migrants from coming in. But economic reasons are, by the way, not the only reasons governing migration. So far, I've talked as a development economist and so on, but we must understand that migration, both the reasons which cause migration and the reasons because of which migration is limited, have to do with non-economic reasons. They have to do with sociological reasons, they have to do with political reasons, and so on. And the causes of migration very often are also sociological, political. You could be a refugee, and so on. So migration is a very, very complex phenomena. It's a social phenomena, it's economic phenomena, it's a political phenomena. In effect, migration in the more broad historical sense, there is a synergy between migration and development. However, this synergy can also be broken by specific patterns of development. And it is for this reason that that migration is not always encouraged, that policies tend to discourage migration. We'll see that in the Indian case also, number of policies which actually discourage migration from happening, in even internal migration, forget about cross-border or international migration. And this, in sum and substance, there is therefore a contradiction. The contradiction is that in the broad historical sense, migration, structural transformation, and growth to go together. But if you look at the specific ways in which migration and development interact, these are not always positive. These could be positive and negative, leading to policies which very often restrict migration, or which cause difficulties to migrants who might be trying to move from one place to another. And it is in this context that we need to understand migration more holistically. So let me just stop here. I just wanted to give you a sense in which we need to proceed and understand what has happened in India. In the next part of my lecture. Let me stop here. If this is a very broad sweep analysis of migration, I have not gone into too many theories. I have not gone into the specific, details. But if there are any questions at this stage, let me handle them. If I'm not going to handle them in the next part of the lecture, and then I'll get on to the next part of the lecture. Resham, if there are any questions at this stage, if I from any of the participants, yes. Otherwise I can go on.
So far they're not. So if there are any questions, we'll wait for a few more seconds. Anyone, if you have any question, you can raise your hand also, and we can allow you to talk if you haven't posted your question, or you can post the question, whatever works with you. So there are no questions so far. So I think since it was more like a broader view that you gave of the whole paradigm of migration, which is
so
very new.
Carry on and talk about the next, the more specific issues in terms of migration. So now let me come to migration in India. In this part of the lecture, the first part of the lecture was not only restricted to internal migration. I gave you a broad framework in which we could speak both of internal migration as well as international migration. But in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk specifically of internal migration in India. And I'm going to speak about the genesis of the migrants crisis. So as I said, like, everywhere else, in India too, we have migration, which is people moving from one area to another area. And we collect data on migration through the census and the National Sample Survey. The census is the biggest source through which we collect data on migration. Now, when we collect data on migration in India, the largest source of migration is something which is not economic in essence. The largest reason why people migrate in India in the census data is basically marriage. The reason for this is that in India, marriages are exogamous. You don't get married. You don't get married in your own village. So normally marriages are non-local. Most women tend to travel from one area to another area when they get married. So marriage becomes a very large reason. When you look at populations, marriage becomes a very large reason for migration in India. And if you look at the 2011 census, almost 46% of the people gave, and women naturally gave migration as a reason. Marriage as a reason for migration. So now that is a non-economic reason, a sociological reason. And similarly, also people move along with families. If somebody's father gets transferred, they would move from one area to another. If the father settles somewhere else, or if the family moves somewhere else, the children would move with the families. All this constitutes a reason for migration. I'm going to confine myself not to these various facets of migration which are non-economic, but primarily talk about the economic reasons for migration. And I'm going to talk about three specific segments of migrants, because this is what this migrant crisis was concerned about. So the most important, when people migrate, they can go from one rural area to another rural area. They can go from rural areas to urban areas. They can move from urban areas to rural areas. So they can go within the same state, or they can travel to other states while migrating. So migrating can be sectorally moving from, as I said, rural to urban, rural to rural, urban to rural, or moving within the same state or across state boundaries. So different kinds of movement. But as I have told you, in migration theory, rural-urban migration is generally treated as the most important, because that development was more about urbanization, industrial growth, and so on. So we normally think of rural-urban migration as being very central to the development project, to the growth, the business of growth. Now, normally when rural-urban migration happens, we think of it as a one-way street. In other words, people travel from rural to urban areas, and they then stay in the urban area. So it's a kind of a permanent migration which happens. But as I told you in the first half of the lecture, the new economics of labor migration gives us an insight why people, when they move from rural to urban areas, might also retain connections with the rural areas. From the household's perspective, this tends to happen because households, as I said, treat migration as a risk diversification strategy. So maybe the son goes to the urban areas, buys a push cart, starts selling vegetables, or joins the service sector, start working as some kind of a wage employee, and then remits money home. So this person goes to the urban area, but retains a connection with the rural areas. He will send money home. If he needs money, then his family in the rural area will support him also. He will go back to the rural area and the rural households during holidays, during festivals. He'll also go back to the rural areas when he or she are unemployed. So if he becomes unemployed, loses an employment, he will go back to the rural area. This is what I call basically circular migration. So people come to from the rural to the urban area, but they retain strong links with the rural area. It is circular because even though they are living and working in the urban area, tomorrow if they lose their job, or maybe once they retire, they may still decide to go back to the rural area. You can call it either long-term circular migration, or you may call it semi-permanent migration. So I am saying that when you look at rural-urban migration, let us think of dividing it into two kinds of migration. One is permanent migrants, people who have moved from rural to urban areas. The other is semi-permanent migrants, so people who've gone from rural to urban areas, but they still have only a foothold in the urban area. They retain their foothold in the rural area. And they may go back to the rural areas once in a while, they may remit money and so on. So these are two major parts, they are the major streams of migration. It is possible that those who go to the urban areas today and are sending money home, tomorrow they may become a permanent migrant. They may stop sending money home. They may stop their links with the rural areas. Their links may weaken over time. In that case, they will join the ranks of the permanent migrants. I'll come to the characteristics of these migrants, what they do and all that, but let us first divide the rural-urban migrants into these two types: permanent migrants on the one hand, and the semi-permanent migrants on the one hand. And then come to the third type of migration, which migration literature talks about. And these migrants are called, basically these are seasonal or short-term circular migrants. So the difference between seasonal and short-term circular migrants and the other migrants is that other migrants have gone to the urban areas. Some have started living permanently in the urban areas. Some are living in the urban areas, but not permanently. They still retain their links. But the seasonal migrants will go to another area, work there for a few months, and then come back to the rural areas. So they do not have a base in the urban area. They don't have a base in the destination. Now, if one starts focusing on what different streams of migrants do, and this is a complex area because, and there is a particular reason why I'm going like this, is because if you look at permanent migrants, what we find when we analyze the data, what we find is that the permanent migrants actually on the whole are better off than non-migrants. So the permanent migrants are on the whole better endowed, they have better education, they are better, on an average they are better. It's not that there are no poor people among them, there are also poor people among them, there are people who work on wages and so on, but on average they are not worse off than the non-migrants. Then we come to the semi-permanent migrants. Among them, there is a large proportion of them who are working in the informal sector and who do very precarious jobs. They're the fruit sellers, they own push carts, they do very temporary jobs in urban areas, they are the sanitation workers, they are factory workers, they are precarious, they hold very precarious jobs in the urban areas. And along with holding precarious jobs, they do not have the kind of entitlements which long-term urban citizens have. So they may not have ration cards. They will not be entitled to housing schemes if the urban government creates a housing scheme. So these people are more vulnerable than other urban citizens because they do not have access to social protection. A large number of these semi-permanent migrants. When it comes to circular migrants, the seasonal migrants, since they go from rural areas, they work in factories, they work in construction sites, they work in other places for a few months in the year, and then they come back to the rural areas. They don't have a proper place to live in the urban area. They don't have any access to what we call social protection. So they don't have a ration card. They don't have a local identity card. They certainly don't have any subsidized housing, access to any subsidized housing and so on. So they are basically people who are all doing precarious jobs. They're all doing precarious jobs. About the data shows that about 40% of them are work in construction. Then about 20% or so work in manufacturing, very precariously, temporary jobs. And then people work in services. And if they migrate from rural areas to rural areas, then they work in brick kilns, they work in mining, and they work in agriculture. But essentially, the short-term circular migrant holds very, very precarious jobs. Now visualize the urban area or visualize those who have lived in this thing. You will find, so basically visualize these three types of migrants. One, the long-term migrants. They don't have any links with rural areas. Then the semi-permanent migrants, and these semi-permanent migrants, we find at about 4/5, 80% of them hold very precarious jobs. And they mainly live in slums, they live in squatter settlements and so on and so forth. And then the third category of migrants, which is the seasonal and short-term migrants. These migrants completely hold, 100% of them hold precarious jobs. So don't have any access to social protection. They don't hold any PDS card. Maybe among the semi-permanent migrants, maybe 15-20% may hold ration cards and so on. They will all be living in rental housing. Very few of them would own a house of any kind. So they would be living in rental houses. But the seasonal circular migrants, where do they live? They generally live on work sites. So they live in a work shed. They live in construction sites. 60 to 70% of them live in work sites. 20-30% of them live in very, very congested settings. So there's a commonality, which is that both semi-permanent migrants in the informal sector and these seasonal migrants, generally their living conditions are very poor. And in the case of seasonal migrants, they are very employer dependent because they live in work sites, work sheds, construction sites, and so on and so forth. So these migrants, these circular migrants and seasonal migrants are essentially very precariously placed. Very precarious. And there are two things which we need to understand, which is now slightly better understood because we have seen the scale of migration. One is that in the Indian workforce, what we call precarity or informality has been growing over the years. What is precarity? What is informality? It is people holding jobs without any job security, without any social security. The proportion of such people in the Indian workforce has been growing over the years. Secondly, the proportion of migrants who hold these precarious jobs has also been growing over the years. So my own estimate shows that about 2 decades ago, about 45% of all precarious jobs outside agriculture were held by these migrants. Short-term circular migrants, long-term circular migrants. Their proportion today is close to 57%. In other words, almost 3 out of 5 precarious jobs in urban areas and in peri-urban areas are held by these short-term circular migrants, long-term circular migrants. Now imagine that these jobs, the informal and precarious jobs that I'm talking about, are 90% of all jobs. So what I'm saying is that 60% of these 90% jobs today, particularly the precarious jobs, are today being held by these circular seasonal migrants. Now, among these migrants, there are migrants, for example, supposing I live in the Delhi NCR area, which is, of course, in some sense, Delhi is a very peculiar area because it does not have a rural hinterland within a state. But supposing I was living in Bombay. Bombay has a large rural hinterland in the Maharashtra state, the same state. So these migrants who live in, very precariously placed migrants who, for example, who live in Bombay city, are of two types. One, those who come from the rural hinterland within Maharashtra state, and the others who come from other states. Now, Bombay, for example, a large number of migrants come from UP, they go from Bihar, they go from, they come from the southern states, from Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and all that. But of course, the overwhelming majority of interstate migrants in Bombay are from UP and Bihar. Again, if you look at Gujarat, a large number of migrants who work in Gujarat's urban areas are from within Gujarat, but there are still a sizable percentage, not very large, but a sizable percentage who come from UP, who come from Bihar, who come from Odisha, who come from Rajasthan. So these are interstate migrants. Okay. Now, my own calculations show that these interstate migrants, circular migrants, currently number about 5.5 to 6 crores. The ones who work are so they're not, it's not that they're not a majority. Interstate migrants are a small percentage of the total migrant population in any city. Most cities are dominated by intrastate migrants. But nonetheless, their numbers were very large, are still very large. And my own estimates are that they were about 5.5 to 6 crores. Now, if you come to the lockdown and the migrant crisis, the lockdown, as you know, was imposed at 4 hours notice. And within 3 to 4 days, it was followed by complete interstate blocking of traffic and inter-district blocking of traffic. This affected the vulnerable migrants. They lost their incomes, lost employment. Many of them did not have a place to stay because where were they staying? They were staying at a construction site. They were staying in work sheds, and those factories closed down, those construction sites closed down, so they were left without a place to stay. So they immediately started trying to get back to their home states. But the central government had imposed a very strict lockdown. It did not want people to travel. So in March, when they tried to go back, some of the intrastate migrants were able to go back because they came over 200, 300 kilometers. Initially, some buses were plying and so on. But those migrants who had traveled over very, very long distances, from, let's say, from UP to Gujarat, from Odisha to Gujarat, from Odisha, Bengal to Kerala, they were stuck. And they were stuck without any income, without any wages, without any food, without any recourse to social protection. And the central government decided to basically decided to impose a very hard lockdown. The Indian lockdown was the most stringent in the world. They were not allowed to move. They were pushed back. They were they were pushed back into shelters. They were pushed back from wherever they came and all that. And for 3 weeks, they were not allowed to move. But when the lockdown was extended beyond 15th of April, then it became impossible for the national government and the state government to keep these people from moving. and they spilled over onto the roads, they spilled over on the highways, and we saw a movement of migrants from about the middle of April, which continued till the end of June for almost 6 weeks in the manner in which all of you have seen, and I don't need to go into it, into the kind of horrendous journeys which they undergo. The government responded extremely slowly by gradually allowing movement only from May. The lockdown began on 24th of March. The government allowed trains to transport them to their homes on the 2nd of May. But the way in which trains were permitted and were allowed to operate, it was still very difficult for migrants to get onto these trains. So the net result was that most of them still walked, hired trucks, got onto buses, got onto all kinds of transport, bought cycles. You know the story of this girl who carried her father back on the cycle all the way from the Delhi NCR to Bihar and so on. So they use all kind of means, and this was not an isolated thing. Millions of migrants walked back. My own sense is that the government figures are that 10 million, 1 crore migrants were transported back on trains and on official buses. My own sense is that roughly 4 to 5 million migrants went back to their home states. Roughly about 30 million, 3 crore were workers, and then their dependents, wives, children, and so on. So almost 4 to 5 crores, about 5 crore migrants went back interstate. There was another 2 to 3 crores which traveled back within the same states because they came from rural areas within the same states. The total reverse migration in this phase may have been to the tune of 7 to 8 crores. 7 to 8 crores people leaving urban and peri-urban areas, mostly in the developed states, from Delhi, the Delhi NCR area, from Punjab, from Haryana, from Gujarat, from Maharashtra, from Karnataka, from Kerala, from Tamil Nadu, from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and moving back to their home areas. Now, this, in my view, caused the largest humanitarian crisis, the largest urban exodus which India has ever seen in its history. It has never been the case that these proportions of people actually left cities to go back to the rural areas. As a result of this urban exodus, I think the country for the first time became exposed to the presence of migrants in its midst. For the first time, the country realized how many migrants there are, the kind of vital role that they play in building our cities, in running our factories, in running our service sector. Because that became the major constraint. So, as unlocking happens, remember, these people were not allowed to go back during lockdown. They were only permitted to go back when unlockdown started. And it is a strange policy contradiction that when unlockdown starts, industry or construction sites start needing workers. And it was precisely when they started needing some workers that workers were leaving in the urban areas and sites in drones to go back to the rural areas. This was clearly a great policy failure, but it's also exposed to us the vital role which migration and migrants have been playing in the urban areas. It also exposed to us how precarious, what kind of precarious existences they lead. That the moment there was a crisis, they lost their jobs. They lost their access to income. They lost places where they lived. We also came to know the kind of places that they live in, the congested surroundings that they live in, whether it was in Surat, where they came out on the roads and protested because they could not have possibly lived in those congested surroundings in the way that they were living before the lockdown. I'll say maybe a little more about it later on. So we became exposed to all this during the crisis. And then the government of India, it had initially announced some measures in March, and I'll discuss this in the next segment of my lecture. It announced some further measures in May, and then followed it up with measures in June, etc. And we are now living at a stage where, in the crisis, where a large number of migrant workers who had gone back to the rural areas are still in the rural areas. A small percentage of them, as you know, construction is reviving, as industry is reviving, there is a small stream of migrants who has come back and has joined work for various reasons. So we are now living in a situation where the rural areas are still seeing a large presence of this reverse migrants, the returnees, the migrant returnees, and the cities are now beginning to see a trickle back, but it's still only a trickle back. And it is still affecting, it is still one of the problems in the supply chain. You know, industries are trying to rebuild their supply chain. And as they rebuild their supply chain, the shortage of labor which they're facing is still a critical constraint, which earlier they did not recognize. So again, I will, in this second segment of my lecture, I wanted to devote myself only to just laying out to all of you the nature of the migrant crisis, how it is related to the different types of migrant streams that we have, the level of precarity which they have been part of. And I want to conclude this segment here, go on into the third segment to talk about policies, what the government of India has done, what the impact of those policies was, and what indeed do we need to do going into the future. So I'll take a few minutes in that in the next segment. So again, if there are any questions on this segment, let me take them here and then go into the next segment.
All right, sir. Everyone, please, you can either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can post your question in the Q&A box. Sir, we have already 2 questions posted. Should I read out, if you allow me?
Sure.
So there's a question by a student who says that, how can less developed areas attract and retain skilled and unskilled migrants?
Okay. So this is really a part of a question which I'll be addressing in the third segment. When I'll talk about the policy issues, I will be addressing them in a little bit more detail, and I'll answer this question specifically in the third segment of my lecture.
All right, sir. Dhruv, so your question will be answered in the third segment. There's another question by Swapnil who says that, I have the question from the first part of the lecture. As you said, people migrate on the basis of expected earnings, and it's generally believed that as a country develops, tertiary sector employees form a large part of the workforce. But with increasing productivity in agriculture and growing demand for organic food, do you think some part of the workforce, instead of going from manufacturing to services, can come back to agriculture and subsequently move from urban to rural?
So again, this is a very interesting question, and this question is also partly related to what I'll do in the third segment if I have time. But let me answer it here. I do believe that there are many reasons. I mean, one reason which Swapnil has himself given, which is that, you know, agriculture itself could move towards higher productivity, growth of organic agriculture, and so on. In other words, it could absorb more skilled, skilled workers, because these organic agriculture and so on do require a better understanding of inputs and various things, the markets, etc. But it's not only agriculture. Actually, the entire non-agricultural economy, in my view, this also links with the first question, partly links with the first question, is moving, the structural changes are moving in a way in which it actually becomes more possible to have a spacious spread of economic activities. In other words, it is now more possible to have economic activities spread. Just earlier I told you that urbanization and industrialization grew hand in hand. Why was this the case? Economists understand this. Economists among you understand that this is because of what is known as scale economies and externalities. It is externalities and scale economies drive what we call agglomeration economies. And agglomeration economies basically pull people together, pull people into urban areas, pull people into industrial activities. Now, we are at a stage of what is known as post-industrial economy, and a post-Fordist economy, where scale economies of a traditional kind are becoming less important, and economic activities are being driven more by IT, basically new communication technologies, and transport costs have also reduced considerably compared to what they used to be. So you can now actually have a greater spatial spread of economic activities than you had earlier. And I'll just give you an example of this, and then maybe we can talk about it later on. I mean, you would not imagine today that some of the top lines of manufacturers, top lines of let's say sports goods, of garments, of electronic goods, which are based in the US, for example, or in Europe, their products or part of their products are being manufactured in rural areas in India, on rural areas in China. That means if production can become so decentralized, and that if value chains can be so extended that part of those value chains can exist already in our rural areas, then that means that the spatial spread of activities is far more possible today than it was possible in the heydays of scale-based manufacturing. Okay, so the answer to your question, Swapnil, is yes, but it's need not only be driven by agriculture, it can also be driven by a dispersal of other types of activities.
Thank you for answering that, sir. Rigved has another question. Can job-centered skills and a sense of development be imbibed in migrants, which would help the people to contribute to villages after coming back to their native place?
Yeah. So the answer to that is absolutely. And we've seen this happen. We've seen this happen after a gap. Kerala is a classic case where, of course, we talk about international migration more than internal migration. But we've seen that after about a generation of migration, where initially remittances were coming back to Kerala, now entrepreneurships and skills are coming back to Kerala. And there's a wave of entrepreneurship in Kerala, which is being fueled by return migrants. So this is entirely possible. But there is a catch here. And the catch here is I referred to you the network effects in migration, which is basically that, migrants tend to form networks, and networks proliferate specific kind of skills. So I don't know how many of you know, for example, I'll give you an example. How many of you know of Kendrapada in Odisha? And if you look at I would assume that if you look around you, almost every one of you would be able to identify a Odia plumber for me. Because Odia plumbers are everywhere. They're all over the country. And if you ask an Odia plumber which district you are from, it's very likely that the answer the Odia plumber would give you, they're from Kendrapada. Now here is the problem. The problem is that if return migration happens to Kendrapada would be flooded with migrants who have all plumbing skills, which they have been taken to all parts of the country. And Kendrapada will never need that many plumbers. Okay, so this is the problem. The problem is that my skill specificity develops in clusters, source clusters. Because of networks, and they're very dense. The skill specificity very dense. I mean, go out and many of you are in Delhi. You may not have used a three-wheeler for some time. Ask your three-wheeler driver where is he from, and it's very likely that in 7 out of 10 cases he'll tell you that he's from North Bihar. It's very unlikely that North Bihar will ever need that many scooter drivers in the near future. Okay, so as people go back, they're going to require reskilling if they are to be absorbed in the local economies.
Right, sir. Right. I think Rigved, hope you have understood. We have a few more questions. Should I just
Yeah, sure. And
read
then
out?
I'll
All right.
try to
All right.
wind up quickly in the next.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. Pushkar asks this question. COVID-19 exposed this crisis, hence we are talking about it. If there was no COVID, we would not have ever known about migration crisis at all. Has there always been a concern about it at a policy level? If yes, what have we done? Or it's just an opening of Pandora's box, given the fact it's a humanitarian crisis?
So he's
So
absolutely right.
very
He's absolutely right. In the policy level in India, China has a very large number of migrants, similarly migrants, but China has now been addressing this migration issue for the last 15 to 20 years. It's been central to their policy concerns. In India, the migration issue has always been brushed under the carpet. I was part of a working group on migration, which gave a very detailed report. And that working group was, by the way, created by the Ministry of Urban Poverty in India, Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. But and we gave an excellent report, but the report was never used. So if you look at the crisis and if you look at the figures that the government of India was doling out, and if you look at what it was saying, basically it was talking nonsense. So the government of India did not itself know that the government of India had created a committee and there was already a sense of recommendations. Okay, so I was part of a commission called the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. We gave a detailed set of recommendations, including on migration. They were never seriously considered. So in the policy sphere, it was never central. And had it not been for this crisis, in the policy sphere, it would still have remained completely peripheral, the migration issue. Many of us have been talking about this for decades, writing about the nature of migration for decades, but it was not moving the policy sphere.
right, sir. And there's one question by Aryan who says, how can the misinformation spread of higher wages in rural areas be solved in India?
I don't know what exactly Aryan means. I mean, maybe he can say, what does he mean, misinformation spread?
Yeah. Aryan, can you rewrite what you mean? Do you mean higher wages in rural areas? Can you elaborate your question a little bit? And so we have one more question. Why most precarious jobs are undertaken by migrants? Is it a systematic pattern when countries grow, or is it specific to India?
It's a wonderful question. I have been, we have been writing, I have been writing that in fact, if you look at the labor market, these are what I call the 3Ds. The most dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs are taken up by migrants. And this is the way labor markets operate. The labor markets operate through a system of contractual jobs, outsourcing of jobs, where when local people either refuse to do a job or demand higher wages for the same job, they're offered to migrants. And migrants are made to do the jobs. And by the way, the migrants who do the most dangerous jobs and the most dirty jobs also happen to belong to basically discriminated communities. So they're scheduled castes, they're scheduled tribes, they are Muslims. They are the people who are made to do the most dirty jobs also. So that is how the labor market is functioning. It is absolutely correct.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the answer. We have, Aryan has written back, how can misinformation spread of higher wage possibility in urban areas than in rural areas be solved in India?
Yeah.
So he's saying, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I hope you, this is clear.
So I don't really, well, in a sense, he's partly right that there is a wage spread in the urban areas. But the question here is that, as I told you, in this sense, if you look at the classical theory of migration, migrants look at expected earnings. The question here is not only of a wage differential between rural and urban areas, actually it's of earning differentials. So migrants who come to the urban areas actually generally come because they can get more days of work. And what has happened over a period of time is that unemployment, that days of work has declined rapidly in rural areas and in agriculture. So if, for example, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, a person could find 150 days of work or 200 days of work in rural areas or in agriculture, the same person will hardly be able to find 70, 80 days of work today. So what drives people to other destination is wage differential, but more than wage differential, employment differentials. You know, the possibility of being able to work for more days, that's a major thing.
Thank you, sir. There's one last question, and guys, we can then take your questions after the session becomes over because we are running a little behind the schedule. Mihir's question is, as the structure of the economy is changing to accommodate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think the socio-economic condition of migrants will be affected?
Now, this is a very complex question because it really it's not only has to do with the socioeconomic situation of migrants, it has to do with the socioeconomic situation of all of us. I mean, the young people who are coming into the labor market, because honestly, first of all, the labor markets, you see, the economic activity may come to a break-even point, you know, maybe in a year's time or maybe in 18 months' time. And thereafter, it may grow beyond what it existed in the pre-lockdown at a slow stage. Full revival is going to take a minimum of 3 years at least, you know. But employment revival, employment was in a bad shape before this crisis, and it will take a very long time, if at all, to revive, for the simple reason that industry is going to adjust strategies, hiring strategies. They move over to higher capital intensity and begin working with fewer people. And this time, for a change, industry will be working not only with fewer people who are low skilled and semi-skilled, but they will be adjusting strategies to save on labor costs also on highly skilled people. So, you know, this is the big difference that we are going to see. And this, again, by the way, has been happening since the last 3 or 4 years. That actually the demand for highly skilled people has been going down, which is why the unemployment levels among the highly educated have been going up very rapidly from the 2015-16 onwards. So these are changes which are highly adverse, and they're going to affect all strata of society, including the migrants. These are labor market changes. Okay. So let me, I'll take, you know, I don't want, I'm spilling over time. I'll take maybe, I'll make this very short, and then if there are any questions, maybe you can just come to it, you know, because I do need to get to what now. Many questions have been asked. So as you people know, the government of India had announced a package to deal with poor people who were affected by the crisis in March itself. It was called the PM Garib Kalyan Yojana. It was supposed to be a 1.7 lakh crore scheme, but I have looked at the figures, and the actual additional budgetary cost was closer to about 90,000 crores. So roughly about 0.45% of annual GDP. And this was based on DBT, direct benefit transfer, using pensions, Jan Dhan Yojana account, PM Kisan Yojana largely, and then PDS and Ujjwala schemes. So these were the 5 main pillars of the scheme which the government of India announced. Now the unfortunate part is that the migrants, and I have already described them to you, most of them were not eligible to any of these benefits. And therefore, there have been a whole series of, the brilliant part about this crisis is that many young people have conducted excellent surveys using telephonic. Though they did distress relief, but they also carried out surveys, and they have brought out reports which tell us that a large percentage of these migrants were not able to access any of these reliefs which were provided by government, which were more directed at sedentary rural households. So they were not able to access it. They were also not able to access most of the relief which was being provided in the form of food by government and by non-governmental agencies, which is what made the state worse. In the next bunch, the government announced a set of schemes under what is known as the Atmanirbhar Bharat Yojana in late May. And under this, there were 2 or 3 schemes which were important. One was a scheme that it extended the Manrega scheme by 40,000 crores. It extended the Manrega budget. Manrega became the lifeline for migrants, and this extension has become an important extension. Secondly, it said that 88 crore migrants would be now entitled to an additional, even if they did not have PDS cards, the states could provide PDS cards to them and they would be entitled to food relief. This was an important measure. There were some other measures which the government announced. And then finally in June, the Prime Minister announced the extension of some of these schemes, particularly the Ujjwala scheme and the PDS schemes have been now extended till November. So basically, as you look at it, the migrants were not able to access scheme while they were stranded, but their households, and as they have got back, their lifeline has become essentially 2 schemes. One, the free PDS, the PDS schemes, and the second, the Manrega scheme. Now, this is a little bit, in a sense, is very ironical because this government did not like the Manrega scheme. And the Prime Minister notably said in one of his parliamentary speeches after he, in his first term as Prime Minister, he said that this is a monumental failure of the first government. But we now know that this monumental failure is what is the lifeline for migrants and unemployed people in rural areas. I'll just point out one interesting fact is that if you look at where Manrega has grown, by the way, and Manrega demand has grown, it has not only grown in Bihar and UP and West Bengal and Chhattisgarh and MP, which is where migrants have gone back. Actually, Manrega demand has also grown in Maharashtra, it has grown in Goa, it has grown in Karnataka, it has grown in Gujarat. Which means that Manrega is also being used by the rural unemployed people in those states and by those migrants who belong to Gujarat state and went back to the rural areas within Gujarat state. So Manrega and PDS, these have become the 2 lifelines of support. In addition to that, of course, some states have announced some schemes. And the 2 states which have announced packages, one is Kerala. Kerala actually announced a 20,000 crore package in March itself, which consisted of MSME support, rural regeneration and all that, migrant support. So at the beginning of the crisis, Kerala announced 20,000 crore scheme package for the affected workers in the affected sectors. In some time ago, Odisha has announced a package, 17,000 crore package for revival of MSMEs, for reskilling, for identification of skills, for rural growth, for rural generation and all that, which is very important. And several other states have announced measures by which they will say that they will carry out rural regeneration in order to absorb migrant workers at home. But the pity of it is that states don't still seem to understand what they want. Or more than 10 states have used this occasion to do away with labor laws, to do away with labor regulation. They have done away even with social security legislations. UP, Gujarat, Himachal, Assam, mostly states with the same political dispensation with the center. But the point here is that these labor regulations are not there. They're there to strike a balance between the interests of industry and workers, and they're there for the long-term interest of development and growth. And the states seem to have taken a very short-term view that if they do this, somehow industry will revive, which is, of course, which is completely, completely meaningless. Industry is at the moment struggling for survival. By removing labor laws, you are not going to attract more investment in any of these states concerned. So basically, the state policies have not been an unmixed blessing for workers. They have not been an unmixed blessing for migrants. And also both the center and the state have at the moment till now not done enough to be able to support the level of distress that we are seeing in the country. Essentially, there are 4 or 5 things that we need to think about, and I'll just very, in bullet form, I'll mention them to you and stop. One is that as a strategy, we need to think in terms of not just rural regeneration, but basically regionally balanced development and in rural and integrated rural urban development. So we used to have a framework for regional development, which in a sense we dismantle with liberalization. But what the pandemic is telling us that we do need to think about regionally balanced development. And we need to invest more resources in thinking how to do it and providing resources to be able to do it. I think that's extremely important. And whatever else we do, the kind of questions that some of you raised will require resources. So, and it is, again, to go back to some of the question that you raised, is possible to do it. But we need to think on those lines today. People are now talking, and the government correctly says vocal for local. So we need to think of what Ela Bhatt, many of you would have heard of her. If you not, go back and Google her. She talks about the 100-mile economy. We need to think of ecologically sound growth, and ecologically sound growth can be built today if we on a different paradigm, where the local really becomes the pillar of the economy. It will be ecologically sound, it will be a more equitable growth. It doesn't mean that you don't integrate nationally or globally, you will, but you will do it on foundations of where local growth is strengthened, and it is, and it will be a much more stronger foundation for growth. That's one thing. Secondly, we need to seriously think about the kind of jobs which have been generated. We need to think about generating more secure jobs. We need to think about creating jobs where people can work with dignity. People complain and industry complains that our labor markets are too rigid. But the response to flexibilizing labor markets is not that you create thoroughly insecure jobs. If you create thoroughly insecure jobs, then you create the recipe for the kind of human disaster that we have seen in the last few weeks and months. Thirdly, the question of public health. We cannot go into the future and invest 1% of our GDP in public health. You know how we have struggled in the pandemic. And we know how we have struggled where? In Bombay, in Delhi, in Tamil, in Chennai, in Bangalore, which have the best health resources in the country. Think of how the country is COVID, the country's health system is coping with COVID in Bihar, in UP, in the district towns, in the Mufassil towns, and so on, where the health infrastructure is almost non-existent. Fourthly, we need to sensitize ourselves. We need to think of our population as being essentially a population which not only has the right, but which will move from place to place in order to maximize development potential. And we need to treat every person who's moving from place to place as a person who is an entitled citizen. So we need to protect the rights of that citizen and provide the entitlements to that person. All social protection arrangements should be portable. People should be able to access them. We should not talk about, in fact, talking about internal migrants is itself an anachronism. The internal migrant is nobody but a citizen who has moved from place X to place Y. And a citizen who's moved from place X to place Y deserved as much dignity, as many rights, as much access to everything as any other citizen. So this requires a total change in the way we look at policies which discriminate against migrants, which particularly discriminate against the vulnerable migrants that we've talked about. So let me stop here. I've already spoken for much longer than your lecture allowed, and I can maybe handle a quick, Resham, subject to the timeline, I can quickly handle.
Yes, sir. So I invite everyone to pose their questions very quickly in the Q&A box. We are already running behind schedule, so just do it very quickly. And I think, sir, you have very concisely put down the measures that should be undertaken, and very rightly, some of the answers that were asked earlier have questions that were asked earlier have been answered of what we should be doing. Any questions, anyone?
So I don't see any new questions.
Yes, yes, sir, there are not any new questions. I think then I'll take this opportunity to thank you for such an informative and insightful session. I think I myself learned so much. I'm sure everybody who has attended would have also learned a lot. And I want to invite our Dean, Dr. G.L. Tayal, to present a vote of thanks. Tayal, sir.
Thank you, Resham, for giving me this opportunity to offer my gratefulness to Professor Srivastava. It has been indeed a very enlightening session. When we were studying at Delhi School of Economics, we were told that possibly for economic analysis, one can use history. So economic history is a very important perspective within which we can look at things. One can use philosophy, economic philosophy, where you really show some kind of sensitivity towards the issues. And one can use data to really prove one's point. I mean, today, Professor Srivastava has used all the three to make his point very clear. He has given us historical perspective, whereby not only the classical, but neo-Marxist and the NELM kind of theoretical explanations about the migration and the relationship between migration and development is explained. Although, as he said very rightly, that this relationship between migration and development is a very complex one and has got multiple nexus. Well, and he has also explained very, very clearly the kind of migrations which have recently taken place in India or over a period of time, and what has been the policy paralysis. I would call it a policy paralysis because the way that he has put it, and rightly so, I think what he said was that in India, essentially most of the time, these migration issues are put under the carpet. Now, or brushed under the carpet. Now, this cannot go because what he has argued very, very ably is that it has linkages with the development. When he is speaking about the advice that we should take care of the migrant workers, he is not only talking in terms of the welfare of the migrant workers, the need of the migrant workers, to take care of what he called the precarious condition of these people. They may be called precariates rather than what we have been in Marxian terminology calling proletariat. So these precariates essentially can be lifted from the situation they are in to a better situation. But at the same time, what he has argued and argued very clearly is that basically this is good for development because industries also need workers. It's a mutual relationship. It is not that only workers need jobs, it is the industry also who need people. So therefore, there is no question about, not looking at the importance of the migrant workers. Basically, the importance lies in the very fact they are instrumental, and therefore 4 suggestions that he has given at the end are very, very important, whether it is the balanced regional development, whether it is a question of the equitable kind of distribution of resources, whether it's a question of security of the jobs, whether it's a question of public health, or a question of giving some kind of rights to the population. These are very fundamental issues. And I think when he is saying that, although he is essentially specializing in economics, but I think he is talking as a sociologist, he is talking as a philosopher, and I think a very sane advice to the politicians, because even for their platform, you know, you need to address the people's needs. You cannot ignore people's need for a long time. So these are very good suggestions, and I think we have been enlightened a lot. Thank you so much, sir. We hope that we will have more such opportunities to get the benefit of your expertise in this area.
Thank you.
I also thank Professor Khan for connecting us with Professor Srivastava. He has been doing a great kind of a contribution to ISBF, this kind of the kind of meetings where the distinguished people are essentially invited to deliver lectures on the topical kind of subjects. And I'm so thankful to you, Resham ma'am, also. She has so ably organized it. But above all, I must thank all the participants, all the students who have participated and who have actively listened to every word which Professor Srivastava has spoken, and also raised very many pertinent questions, which I think even Professor Srivastava appreciated. So thank you all for this wonderful kind of a meeting. And here I end my vote of thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe shukriya ada kar दूं, Professor
Yes, sir. Yes.
Ravi Srivastava, from last year, I think for about 1 year, I have been discussing your name in the ISBF, and finally I succeeded in bringing you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Khan sir. Thank you. You have been very valuable, sir, in this respect.
Thank you so much.
Also, sir, as a token of appreciation and thanking you, we have planted a tree in your name since we could not meet you in person. So we found an online and eco-friendly way to show our gratitude. Sir, can you show the certificate? Anji, sir?
I'm just trying to share it. Just
Yes, sir. So it's basically a project in Telangana, Panchadhanam, where you can plant a tree in somebody's name. So we have done that.
Okay. Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful, sir, to have you.
Thank you. Okay, bye. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
And thank you everyone for joining this session and making it so engaging by your wonderful questions. Thank you everyone. We'll stop the session now.